we all have this kind of internal compass, don't we? A sense of, who we are.
Hmm.
But when you actually stop and think about it, how does that compass really get set?
Right.
Especially with things like um, culture, race, sexual orientation.
Right. It really shapes everything, how we see the world, how we connect or don't connect with people.
Exactly. And I bet a lot of people listening are curious about this stuff, wanting to get a handle on it without wading through like super dense academic texts.
And that's exactly what we're aiming for today.
Good.
Yeah, this deep dive, we're going to explore some honestly really enlightening models, frameworks for understanding this whole journey of identity development.
Okay.
We've pulled together insights from different sources outlining these models. The mission really is to pull out the core ideas, the stages, the perspectives they offer on how people figure out who they are, regarding culture, race, sexuality.
Getting a deeper understanding of ourselves and others, but efficiently.
Precisely, without getting totally bogged down.
Okay, let's dive in then. First model on the list is the racial cultural identity development model. Atkinson, Morton, and Sue.
Yep.
And this one basically lays out 5 stages people tend to go through. Understanding themselves, their own culture, the dominant one, and the power stuff between them.
Exactly. And what's, I think, particularly useful about starting here is how it maps out this potential shift in perspective. Stage 1 is conformity.
Conformity, okay.
So here you often see individuals really leaning into the values of the dominant culture, sometimes even holding kind of negative views about their own cultural background.
Huh. So they might even prefer, say, a therapist from the majority group.
That's often the case in this stage, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the dominant culture is the benchmark, the standard. Everything else gets measured against it.
Right, right. Almost like mirroring what's presented as the default or the ideal. Okay, so then comes stage 2, dissonance. That sounds, well, like things get shaky.
They do. It's exactly that unsettled. This stage, it's marked by a growing awareness of contradictions. People start feeling this internal conflict. They encounter things, situations, information that just doesn't quite fit with what they believed before about themselves or different groups.
And this is where they might start thinking differently about therapy, too.
Yeah, maybe starting to prefer a therapist from a minority background, and they might begin connecting personal problems, their struggles, to their racial or cultural identity for the first time.
Ah, okay. So it's like a crack appearing in that initial conformity.
That's a great way to put it. The worldview starts to feel insufficient.
So where does that typically lead? What's next?
Stage 3 is resistance and immersion. And this is often a really major turning point.
Okay.
Individuals tend to actively, sometimes quite strongly, reject the dominant society. And at the same time, they develop this really powerful sense of pride and positivity towards their own group.
So a complete flip from stage 1 almost.
In many ways, yes. They'd likely want a therapist from their own group now, and they're much more inclined to see their issues as stemming from oppression from the system.
Right.
What's fascinating here is often just the sheer intensity of it. It's about dismantling the old views and really fully embracing this new understanding.
That sounds like a really powerful reclaiming of identity, but I'm guessing maybe not the final start.
No, it usually evolves. Stage 4 is introspection.
Introspection.
So here, some of that maybe rigidity from stage 3 starts to soften a bit. People might feel a little uncertain about the really absolute stances they held.
Okay.
There can be this tension between, like, loyalty to their group and a growing need for personal autonomy. Thinking for themselves, maybe questioning group norms a little.
Interesting. What about the therapist preference? Still the same?
Generally, still preferring someone from their own group, but they become more open. Open to therapists who share a similar worldview, a similar understanding of the world, even if their specific backgrounds are different.
I see. So it's becoming a bit more nuanced. Less about strict categories, more about shared outlook.
Exactly. It's like they're starting to integrate that group identity with their personal identity in a more sophisticated way.
Okay. And that brings us to stage 5, integrative awareness. What's the key feature here?
This stage is really marked by a deep sense of self-acceptance, fulfillment, regarding their cultural identity.
Right.
There's also usually a really strong desire to challenge oppression, not just for their group, but like all forms of it. They tend to adopt a multicultural perspective,
Meaning
they can look objectively at the values and beliefs of all groups, their own included, without automatically saying one is better than another.
Okay.
And interestingly, in therapy, the focus shifts. It becomes more about the therapist's shared worldview, their understanding, rather than just matching race or culture.
That sounds like a very, yeah, mature and balanced place to land. But you mentioned this isn't always just a straight line, A to B to
Absolutely not. The model stresses that. People might move through these stages, sure, but they can also stay in one stage for a long time, or even move back and forth.
depending on life experiences.
Exactly. Especially interactions across different cultures. Things can happen that push you forward or maybe trigger a step back into an earlier stage's way of thinking.
And that could cause friction maybe within families if people are at different stages.
Oh, definitely. That dynamic aspect can absolutely lead to misunderstandings or even conflict if, say, parents and children are in very different places in their identity journey.
That makes total sense. Okay, so that's a really helpful overview of the racial cultural identity development model. Now, we also looked at Cross's Black racial identity development model, the Nigrescence model. How does that one fit in or differ?
Right, so the Nigrescence model, it zooms in specifically on the Black identity development experience.
Okay.
And it's interesting because the model itself evolved. Cross's initial work had 5 stages, but later versions refined it into a 4-stage framework.
Yeah.
And crucially, it incorporates this idea of race salience.
Race salience, what does that mean exactly?
Think of it as simply how important or central race feels to a person's sense of self at any given time. It can fluctuate.
Got it. So it adds that layer.
Yeah. And later versions also broke down some stages, like pre-encounter and internalization, into substages. Gives you a more detailed picture.
Right, a more focused lens on Black identity experiences. Let's walk through those 4 main stages, maybe touching on the substages too.
Sure. Stage 1 is pre-encounter. Here, race just doesn't have a high level of significance in the person's day-to-day life or identity.
Okay. Low salience.
Exactly. And within that, there are a couple of main substages described. One is assimilation, where someone adopts a mainstream, often white-defined identity.
Right.
Then there's the anti-Black substage. This is where someone has actually internalized negative stereotypes about Black people, which, as you can imagine, often links to lower self-esteem.
That sounds incredibly difficult.
It really is. And generally across the whole pre-encounter stage, the preference is usually for a white therapist, if therapy is sought.
Okay. So what typically triggers a move out of that pre-encounter state? What makes race more salient?
That's the encounter stage. This is usually sparked by a specific significant race-related event, or maybe a series of smaller events.
Like experiencing racism directly or seeing it.
Could be either, yeah.
Yeah.
Something happens that jolts their awareness. Suddenly, race and its impact become much more real, much more personal.
And that sparks a change.
It often sparks this interest, this desire to learn about and develop a stronger Black identity.
Yeah.
And at this point, the preference usually shifts towards wanting a therapist of the same race,
Right.
someone who might better get it.
Right. It's like a catalyst, an awakening moment.
Exactly. It forces a reevaluation of how they see themselves and the world.
Okay, so after that heightened awareness of the encounter, what comes next?
Next up is the immersion stage. Now, race salience is high, very central.
Okay.
This stage is 2 parts. First, immersion. This is often characterized by an intense idealization of Blackness, Black people, Black culture.
Right.
And it can be coupled with strong feelings, sometimes anger towards white people, and maybe guilt or anxiety about their own previous lack of awareness in the pre-encounter stage.
So really strong emotions.
Very strong. Then comes the immersion substage. Here, some of that intense emotion starts to level out a bit, but there's still often a rejection of white culture as the person works really hard to internalize and solidify their Black identity.
So the whole stage is about really diving deep into Blackness and pushing away from whiteness.
That's a good summary. It's often described as intense Black involvement and frequently anti-white attitudes during this phase.
It sounds like a really important, maybe challenging, but necessary phase of sorting things out. What's the final stage in Cross's model?
The final stage is internalization. Race continues to be salient, it's still important, but the person has kind of settled into one of several identity orientations.
Okay, what are those?
Well, there's a pro-Black, non-racist orientation, sometimes called Afrocentric. There's also a biculturalist orientation, integrating a Black identity with another major cultural identity, like maybe white American identity, for instance.
Okay.
And then there's a multiculturalist orientation, integrating Black identity with 2 or more other significant cultural identities.
So different ways of integrating that Black identity into a broader sense of self.
Exactly. And it's important to note, folks in this internalization stage, especially maybe those with a strong Afrocentric identity, They might be actively working against racism.
Right.
And in therapy, they might display what's been called healthy cultural paranoia.
Healthy cultural paranoia.
Yeah, it sounds a bit intense, but it just means absolutely. Helms's model focuses specifically on what it means to develop a white identity, but critically within the context of a society where racism is, well, deeply embedded.
Okay.
Her view is that racism is sort of central to being white in America. And identity development for white people involves grappling with that, moving away from racism and developing a positive, non-racist white identity.
And she breaks this down, too.
Yes, into two broad phases, abandoning racism and developing a non-racist identity. And these are further detailed in 6 specific statuses. Each status also has a characteristic way of processing race-related information, which she calls an information processing strategy, or IPS.
IPS, okay, like a mental filter or approach.
Sort of, yeah, how people handle information and feelings about race.
Got it. 6 statuses. Let's go through them. First is contact status.
Okay, contact. Here, individuals generally have pretty limited awareness of racism and even of their own racial identity as white.
Kind of oblivious.
Largely, yes. They might express some maybe naive or unsophisticated racist attitudes, often unintentionally. And they tend to judge minority groups using white cultural norms as the standard.
And the IPS.
Obliviousness and denial, just not seeing it, or rejecting the idea that race and racism are significant.
Okay. Like a colorblind ideal, maybe, but not acknowledging the reality.
That's often how it manifests, yes.
Right.
So next is disintegration status.
It's disintegration.
Here, awareness starts to creep in. Awareness of race, of racism, of inequality. And this creates internal conflict, confusion, maybe guilt or anxiety. It's uncomfortable.
How do people tend to cope with that discomfort?
Helms suggests a few ways. Maybe over-identifying with minority groups, but perhaps in a superficial way, or acting kind of paternalistically, or sometimes just retreating back into mostly white social circles to avoid the discomfort.
And the IPS.
It involves suppression, trying to push down the uncomfortable thoughts or information, and ambivalence, feeling torn.
Right, grappling with new, difficult information. Then we get to reintegration status. What's happening there?
Reintegration is often an attempt to resolve that moral dilemma, that discomfort from the disintegration stage. But how? Often by idealizing white society and actively blaming minority groups for their problems.
Oh, okay. So a shift towards defensiveness.
Very much so. You might hear resentment about affirmative action, talk about reverse discrimination, seeing white people as the victims now.
And the thinking strategy, the IPS.
Selective perception, really only paying attention to information that confirms their biases and negative outgroup distortion, basically viewing minority groups negatively.
That sounds like a way to protect their existing worldview, even if it's flawed. What pushes someone out of that? What leads to the next stage? Pseudo-independence.
Usually it takes some kind of jarring event, or maybe sustained experiences that really force the person to confront the reality of racism and maybe their own role or white people's role in it.
Okay.
They might start getting intellectually curious about racial differences, maybe read books or articles, but the understanding often stays kind of cognitive on the surface, less of a deep emotional connection to it yet.
So learning about it, but not fully feeling it or integrating it.
Exactly. The IPS reflects that. Still some selective perception, but maybe a bit more openness and reshaping reality, trying to fit the new information into their existing framework without fundamentally changing it too much.
More of a head-level thing initially. How does it deepen?
It leads into the immersion status. This is where the real work often begins.
Okay.
Individuals actively start exploring, what does it actually mean to be white in this society? They begin to confront their own biases, understand white privilege, those unearned advantages.
Right.
And they develop a much deeper, more experiential and emotional understanding of racism and how it impacts people. Not just intellectually knowing, but starting to feel it more.
And the IPS here.
Hypervigilance, becoming very aware of racial dynamics all around them and reshaping, actively working to change their own understanding and behaviors.
That sounds like a much more profound engagement. Self-reflection.
Yeah.
And the final status in Helms's model is autonomy. What's that look like?
Autonomy status is where someone has really internalized a positive, non-racist white identity. There's a genuine appreciation for both cultural differences and similarities.
Okay.
They actively seek out diverse interactions, they're comfortable in those settings, and they're usually committed to actively working against racism. It's integrated into who they are.
And the IPS.
Flexibility, being open to new perspectives, new information, and complexity, holding a much more nuanced understanding of race and racism. not seeing things in black and white, so to speak.
Helms also talked about how these statuses play out in therapy between therapist and client, right?
Yes, she proposed this interaction model. For example, a parallel interaction is when the therapist and client are at similar identity levels. This might feel comfortable, maybe understanding, but if they're both at, say, contact status, not much growth might happen.
Right. Could lead to inertia.
Exactly. Then there's progressive interaction. That's when the therapist is at least one stage more advanced than the client. Helms suggested this is generally the most effective because the therapist can guide and challenge the client forward.
Makes sense.
The opposite is regressive interaction. The client is actually more advanced than the therapist. This, understandably, often leads to conflict. Maybe the client feels misunderstood and they might allow therapy early.
Yeah, I can see that.
And finally, crossed interaction. This is when the therapist and client have basically opposite attitudes towards race. Maybe one is in reintegration and the other in immersion. Highly confrontational, likely.
Wow. Has research looked into this?
Yeah, research generally supports the idea that white therapists who function from that autonomy status tend to be rated as more effective, particularly when working with clients from minority backgrounds.
That really underlines how important that ongoing self-work is for therapists. Okay, shifting gears one last time, our final model for this dive, the homosexual or gay lesbian identity development model by Troyden.
Right. Troyden's model offers a four-stage framework for understanding how many individuals come to develop a gay or lesbian identity.
Okay, 4 stages. Let's hear them.
Stage 1 is sensitization, feeling different. This often starts pretty early, maybe middle childhood. It's not necessarily about sexuality yet, but just this vague feeling of being different from other kids of the same gender, maybe different interests, different feelings.
So an early, maybe confusing sense of just not quite fitting the mold. What's stage 2?
Stage 2 is self-recognition identity confusion. This usually kicks in around puberty. It's when the person becomes consciously aware of same-sex attractions.
Ah, okay.
And they might start thinking, okay, maybe this means I'm gay or lesbian. And that realization often brings a lot of internal turmoil, questioning, confusion, anxiety, trying to figure out what these feelings mean.
Yeah, that sounds like a potentially really difficult, isolating time. What happens next in the model?
Stage 3 is identity assumption. Here, there's growing certainty about being gay or lesbian. The am I question starts to fade.
Yeah.
And then the focus shifts to dealing with that realization. Troyden described a few ways people might navigate this. Trying to pass as straight, actively seeking out the gay or lesbian community for connection and validation, or maybe even adopting stereotypical behaviors as a way to kind of understand or express this identity.
So different strategies for managing this emerging identity in the world. And the final stage.
Stage 4 is commitment identity integration. In this stage, the individual has really accepted and integrated their homosexual identity into their overall sense of who they are.
So it's part of them, not the whole definition, but an accepted part.
Exactly. They often adopt a homosexual way of life, whatever that means for them, and might become more open, more public about their sexual orientation in different parts of their life.
Now, Troyden's isn't the only model for LGBT identity, is it? There are others.
Oh, absolutely. Many others exist, focusing on bisexual identity, transgender identity, and so on. But a lot of them share similar themes, often starting with some kind of awareness of being different, potentially questioning orientation, exploring it. For instance, Sophie's model for lesbian identity development has stages like first awareness, testing and exploration, identity acceptance, and then identity integration. Very similar concepts.
So even though they focus on different aspects, race, culture, sexual orientation, these models seem to tap into some maybe universal human processes of figuring ourselves out.
I think that's right. They offer these really valuable lenses, these frameworks for understanding not just others, but our own journeys too, highlighting the complexity, the nuances, the deeply personal nature of developing an identity.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We looked at the racial cultural identity development model.
Yep.
Cross's black racial identity, Nigrescence model. Helms's white racial identity model.
Yeah.
And Troyden's homosexual gay lesbian identity model. Phew, that's quite the tour. But hopefully, for everyone listening, it gives a much clearer map of these important ideas.
Yeah, and what's really striking, I think, is seeing those common threads, right, across these different models, focusing on different things.
Definitely.
Whether it's race, culture, sexuality, you often see this pattern. Some kind of initial awareness or confusion, then a period of digging in, exploring, questioning.
Right, the immersion or exploration phases.
Exactly. And then hopefully moving towards some kind of integration, acceptance, a more solid sense of self.
Yeah.
It really does feel like a fundamental human process.
Yeah, it does. But at the same time, each model really highlights the specific context, doesn't it? Like, you can't understand racial identity without talking about power dynamic.
Absolutely. That's central to the RCID model and Helms's model.
And the Nigrescence model really underscores the specific ongoing impact of anti-Black racism.
For sure.
And Helms forces a look at white privilege and bias. And Troyden, the whole context of navigating sexual orientation in a world that often assumes everyone is straight.
Right. The unique pressures and factors in each specific journey are crucial. You can't just mush them all together.
So hopefully, connecting back to what you said at the start, listener, about wanting knowledge efficiently,
Yeah.
we hope this deep dive did that. Gave you a structured, but hopefully still accessible way into these complex, important topics. Kind of a shortcut to the key ideas in identity development.
Without getting lost in every single academic debate.
Exactly. So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with. As you go about your day, your week, how might understanding these models, even just a little bit, change how you interact with people?
Mm-hmm.
Or how might it shift your own sense of self navigating this incredibly diverse, always changing world?
It's a good question. Maybe think about, where you might see yourself or people, reflected in some of these stages or ideas.
Yeah, not to rigidly label anyone, definitely not.
No, yeah, not at all. But maybe as a lens, a way to foster a bit more empathy, a bit more understanding.
Right. Using it as a tool for insight and connection rather than just putting people in boxes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just something to mull over.